I opened my eyes to the smell of expensive sandalwood and the sound of someone sobbing. Mylin, how could you be so cruel? The voice belonged to Yang Ju, the crown prince. He was holding Lin Ru, the girl he'd eventually kill me for, as she wept over a ruined silk painting. In the original book, I would have screamed my innocence. I would have begged him to believe me, only to be slapped and stripped of my title. But as I looked at his handsome, arrogant face, I felt nothing. Just a mild annoyance, like looking at a corrupted file on a hard drive. You want an apology? I asked, standing up and dusting off my robes. The crowd of nobles gasped. I was supposed to be kneeling. I want you to realize your place. Yang Ju hissed. I smiled, a calm, chilling smile that stopped the breath in his throat. My place? My place is currently being wasted in this garden. Your Highness, since you love this fragile flower so much, she can have you. Consider our engagement a bad debt. I'm writing it off. I turned my back on the future emperor. I didn't see his shocked expression, and I didn't care. The imperial exams were in 3 months. I had an empire to run, and I didn't have time for a man who couldn't even manage his own household. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you enjoy your time here. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. It really helps this channel grow and keeps the stories coming. The silence in the garden was deafening. In the original novel, this was the turning point. The moment Song Mylin lost her dignity and began her descent into madness. But as I walked away, the only thing I felt was the exhilarating weight of freedom. Song Mylin, stand still. Yang Ju's voice thundered behind me. I heard his heavy footsteps, the sound of a man used to being chased, not left behind. He grabbed my wrist, his grip tight and burning. I looked down at his hand, then up into his eyes. They were beautiful, yes, but empty of anything but self-importance. Is this a new game? He sneered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of confusion. You think by acting indifferent, I'll forget that you pushed Ruo? You're the daughter of a prime minister. Act like a future princess. I pulled my arm back with a sharp, clinical strength. Your Highness, you seem to have a reading comprehension problem. I said the engagement is over. You can keep the princess title. I've decided I'd rather be a person than a piece of property. I didn't wait for his response. I walked straight to my carriage, leaving the crown prince of the great Liang Empire standing amongst the peonies, looking like a man who had been slapped with a cold fish. The carriage ride back to the Song Manor was the first time I could breathe. I closed my eyes and accessed the system of the novel's world. This wasn't a game, but my modern brain organized information like a spreadsheet. Status: disgraced noblewoman. Current asset: high-level political connections, father. Goal: the spring imperial examination. Obstacle: 500 years of tradition forbidding women from holding office. When I entered my father's study, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and power. Prime Minister Song looked up, his face a mask of disappointment. Mylin, I heard what happened at the palace. You threw away a marriage to the throne for a temper tantrum? Do you know how much I sacrificed to secure that position for you? Father, I said, sitting across from him without being asked. I saw his eyebrows twitch. The old Mylin would have been weeping on the floor. I didn't throw away a throne. I traded a sinking ship for a life raft. Yang Ju doesn't want a wife. He wants a shield for his mistress. If I marry him, our family will be dragged down the moment he decides I'm no longer useful. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register. The crown prince is weak. He relies on your military might but resents you for it. Within 2 years, he would have found a reason to execute us for treason to seize your assets. Is that the future you bought for me? My father went pale. He was a politician. He knew the ruthlessness of the court. He just hadn't expected his spoiled daughter to see it. Then what do you propose? He whispered. You are a woman. Without a marriage, you are nothing. I want to sit for the imperial examinations, I said. He laughed. It was a dry, mocking sound. Women aren't allowed. It's the law of the ancestors. The law of the ancestors says the most capable shall serve, I countered, pulling a scroll from my sleeve, a draft of a legal reform I'd written using modern administrative logic. I've analyzed the last 10 years of tax revenue from the southern provinces. Your current ministers are skimming 15%. I can fix the deficit in 6 months. Tell the emperor I am your secretary for now. Let me prove my worth in the shadow of your name. When the exams come, I won't ask for permission. I'll make myself indispensable. The next 3 months were a blur of ink-stained fingers and flickering candles. I didn't go to the balls. I didn't send letters to Yang Ju. I didn't even acknowledge the rumors that he was seen everywhere with Lin Ru, buying her jewels that should have been mine. Every morning, I woke at 4 a.m. to study the classics, law, and economics. I translated modern concepts of due process into the flowery prose of the great Liang. I learned how to move through the manor like a ghost, avoiding my mother's tearful pleas for me to fix things with the prince. One evening, while I was researching irrigation maps in the royal library, using my father's seal to gain entry, I realized I wasn't alone. A man stood in the shadows of the tall cedar shelves. He was dressed in simple, midnight blue robes, but the way he held himself screamed authority. This was Lu Shen, the Grand Secretary, the man the book called the coldest heart in the capital. The maps of the Han River are outdated, he said, his voice like velvet over gravel. He didn't look at me, but his eyes were fixed on the scroll in my hand. The silt buildup near the dam makes your current calculations for the grain tax optimistic. I didn't flinch. I've already accounted for the silt, Lord Lu. If you look at the secondary ledger, I've proposed a dredging system funded by a luxury tax on imported silks. It keeps the peasants fed and the merchants busy. Finally, he looked at me. His gaze was piercing, analytical. He didn't look at my face or my dress. He looked at my mind. You're the Song girl, he stated. The one who went mad and dumped the prince. I'm the Song girl who woke up, I corrected, rolling up the scroll. And I'm not dumping a prince. I'm upgrading my career. Lu Shen took a step closer, the scent of cold rain and ink following him. The imperial exam is in 2 weeks. A woman has never sat for it. They will tear you apart before you even pick up the brush. Let them try, I said, meeting his gaze with a challenge. I've spent my whole life being torn apart to fit into a lady's corset. A few scholars with brittle egos don't frighten me. For the first time in the history of the original novel, the stoic Lu Shen smiled. It wasn't a romantic smile. It was the smile of a general who had just found a new weapon. Then I look forward to grading your paper, Secretary Song. The day of the exam arrived. The gates of the Dragon Hall loomed large. Hundreds of men in scholars' robes stood in line, whispering and nervous. When I arrived, dressed in a plain, gender-neutral scholar's robe with my hair pulled back in a simple silver capping, the whispers turned into a roar. Is that a woman? Isn't that the Prime Minister's daughter? She's lost her mind. Guards! Remove her! I didn't move. I held my identification plaque, signed by the Prime Minister himself, and walked toward the gate. Step aside, I said to the guard, who looked like he'd seen a ghost. Suddenly, a carriage emblazoned with the imperial crest pulled up. Yang Ju stepped out, looking regal and furious. Behind him, Lin Ru peeked out, her face a mask of concern. My Lin, stop this embarrassment at once. Yang Ju shouted, his voice drawing the attention of every scholar in the square. Have you no shame? To come here and mock the sacred traditions of the empire just because I chose another? This is the lowest you've ever stooped. I turned to him, my expression one of pure, unadulterated boredom. Your Highness, the world doesn't revolve around your love life, I said loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm not here for you. I'm here because the Ministry of Justice is incompetent, the Treasury is leaking gold, and quite frankly, I'm the best person for the job. You are a woman, he hissed, grabbing my shoulder. Your job is to produce heirs, not laws. Then it's a good thing I'm not your wife, I whispered, leaning in close so only he could hear. Watch closely, Yang Ju. Today is the last day you get to look down on me. From tomorrow, you'll have to look up. I shook off his hand and stepped through the gates. The guards, intimidated by my father's seal and the sudden appearance of Lu Shen at the entrance, didn't stop me. As I sat down at my small wooden desk, the smell of fresh ink filled my lungs. I picked up the brush. My hand didn't shake. The first question was, how does one ensure the longevity of an empire? I dipped my brush in the ink and began to write. An empire is not sustained by the blood of its heirs, but by the fairness of its laws and the education of its people. I wasn't writing a love letter. I was writing a death warrant for the old world. The scratching of hundreds of brushes was the only sound in the examination hall. I didn't look up, not even when the shadow of the invigilator passed over my desk. I could feel the burning gazes of the male scholars around me, eyes full of ridicule, waiting for me to break, waiting for me to realize I didn't belong. But I had survived bar exams in a world of high-speed transit and cutthroat law firms. This was just ink and paper. 3 days. We lived, ate, and slept in those tiny cubicles. By the third day, men half my age were being carried out on stretchers, fainting from the mental strain. I remained. My back was a straight line of iron, my movements precise. I wasn't just answering questions. I was dismantling centuries of inefficient bureaucracy. When the final bell rang, I stood up. My fingers were stained black with ink, a mark of honor I wore more proudly than any silk embroidery. As I exited the hall, the crowd of spectators had grown. At the front stood Yang Ju. He looked disheveled, as if he had spent the last 3 days pacing. Beside him, Lin Ru clutched a handkerchief, her eyes darting toward the exit. Mylin, Yang Ju stepped forward, his voice uncharacteristically soft. The farce is over. You've had your fun. Come home. I've spoken to the Emperor. He's willing to overlook this episode if you apologize and accept a position as a secondary consort. I stopped. I didn't laugh, though I wanted to. A secondary consort? A backup prize for a man who couldn't appreciate the original gold? Your Highness, I said, my voice clear and carrying through the courtyard. You still don't get it. I didn't come here to get your attention. I came here to take your power. If I were you, I'd spend less time worrying about my marital status and more time studying the grain reports from the north. You're about to have a very difficult autumn. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his. I felt him reach for me, but a tall, imposing figure stepped between us. Lucian. The Grand Secretary didn't say a word. He simply looked at the prince with a gaze so cold it could have frozen the palace fountains. Yang Ju recoiled, his face flushing with a mix of fear and fury. The papers are being graded, Your Highness, Lucian said calmly. Let the merit speak for itself. The week of waiting was a test of a different kind. The capital was on fire with gossip. The villainess of the Song family had dared to enter the Forbidden City not as a bride, but as a scholar. Lin Ru tried one last tactic. She came to my manor, uninvited, her eyes red from crying. Sister Mylin, she sobbed, reaching for my hands. I stepped back, letting her fall toward the empty air. Why are you doing this? The prince is so hurt. He loves you in his own way. Why must you humiliate him by trying to be a man? I looked at her, really looked at her. She was a product of her environment, taught that tears were her only weapon. Rua, I said, my voice not unkind, but firm. I'm not trying to be a man. I'm trying to be a person. You spend your days calculating how to make him smile so he'll buy you a trinket. I spend my days calculating how to stop a famine so 10,000 girls like you don't starve. We are not the same. And frankly, you're far too intelligent to be this pathetic. Stop crying. It's bad for your skin. She froze, her fake sob dying in her throat. For a second, just a second, the white lotus mask slipped, and I saw a flash of genuine, confused realization in her eyes. The day of the results was a festival of nerves. The gold list, the names of the successful candidates, was to be posted on the palace gates. Thousands gathered. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and anticipation. I stood at the back of the crowd, dressed in my father's old scholar robes, my heart beating a steady, rhythmic drum. The crier emerged. The scrolls were unfurled. Third rank, Scholar Zhao of the Southern Isles. Second rank, Scholar Chen of the capital. The crowd gasped. The top spot, the Zhuang Yuan, was the most prestigious title in the land. It usually went to a seasoned scholar, someone with decades of study. The crier took a deep breath, his voice trembling slightly. First rank, the Zhuangyuan of the Great Liang. Song Mylin. The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the entire city had stopped breathing. Then, the roar started. It wasn't a cheer. It was a riot of disbelief. A woman. Impossible. The exams were rigged. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was my father. He wasn't looking at the list. He was looking at me, tears streaming down his face. For the first time, he didn't see a daughter he had to sell for a title. He saw his legacy. I stepped forward, weaving through the shouting men, until I stood at the very front. I looked up at my name, written in bold, black strokes. Above the crowd, on the balcony of the palace, I saw them. Yang Ju looked as if he had been struck by lightning. He was gripping the marble railing so hard his knuckles were white. He had expected me to fail, to come crawling back, to prove that his world was the only one that mattered. Instead, I had just rewritten his laws. Lucian stood beside him, his arms crossed over his chest. Our eyes met across the distance. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He simply gave a slow, respectful nod. The message was clear. Welcome to the court, Minister Song. Now the real war begins. The morning of my first day in the imperial court was cold. I chose a robe of deep charcoal silk, not the bright, fluttering colors of a noble lady, but the structured, high-collared uniform of a fourth-rank official. My hair was pulled back into a tight, professional knot. I didn't need jewelry. The silver insignia on my chest was the only ornament that mattered. As I walked through the Meridian Gate, the whispers followed me like a draft. I wasn't entering as a consort-to-be, hiding behind a carriage curtain. I was walking on the central path, reserved for the scholars of the empire. Minister Song, a voice called out. I stopped. Yang Ju was standing by the marble stairs, his face a complex map of regret and simmering anger. He looked at my official robes as if they were a personal insult. You've made your point, Mylin, he said, stepping into my path. The emperor gave you the title to appease your father and show mercy. But you don't actually intend to stay, do you? You'll be the laughingstock of the court. One mistake, and your father's head will be on the block beside yours. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt genuine pity. He truly couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't the son. Your Highness, I'm not here for mercy, I replied, my voice as steady as the stones beneath us. I'm here because your Ministry of Works hasn't updated the damn schematics in 40 years. While you were picking out pearls for Lin Ru last night, I was calculating the structural integrity of the northern levees. If those dams break, the grain supply for the capital vanishes. I suggest you move. I have a briefing with the emperor, and I'm not in the habit of keeping my superiors waiting. I walked past him, leaving him fuming in the morning mist. The hall of supreme harmony was a sea of crimson and blue robes. As I entered, the silence was so heavy it felt physical. Hundreds of men turned to stare. Some looked disgusted, others looked curious. At the front, near the throne, stood Lucian. He was the youngest Grand Secretary for a reason. His mind was a fortress. Today, his eyes flickered with something that looked suspiciously like pride. The emperor is present, the eunuch cried. We all knelt. The rustle of silk was like the sound of 1,000 birds taking flight. Rise, the emperor's voice boomed. He was an old man, tired of the bickering of his ministers. We have a new voice in our court. Minister Song, the Grand Secretary tells me you have a proposal regarding the southern trade routes. I stepped forward. This was it. The original Song Mylin would have fainted from the pressure. But I was a modern woman trained in the art of the presentation. I unfurled a map I had drawn myself. It wasn't the vague, artistic map the court was used to. It was a topographical blueprint with projected trade figures. Your Majesty, I began, my voice clear and projecting to the back of the hall. The current routes are controlled by local clans who take a 40% cut in protection fees. By establishing an imperial escort and standardizing the way stations, we can double the treasury's intake in one fiscal year without raising a single tax on the peasants. Nonsense, an elderly minister shouted. A woman talking of trade and taxes? She probably had her father's clerks write this for her. Minister Chen. I turned to him, my eyes sharp. If my father's clerks wrote this, then why did they miss the embezzlement in your provincial office last quarter? I noticed the discrepancy while cross-referencing the salt permits. Page 42 of the ledger. Would you like me to cite the specific dates, or shall we save that for the Ministry of Justice? The hall went deathly quiet. Minister Chen's face went from red to a sickly, pale gray. Lu Shen stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. I have verified Minister Song's data. Her logic is sound, and her observations regarding the salt permits are illuminating. The Emperor leaned back, a small smile playing on his lips. Proceed, Minister Song. For the next 4 hours, I held the floor. I didn't just survive. I dominated. I used logic like a scalpel, cutting through the bloated egos of men who hadn't read a book in a decade. By the time the session ended, the atmosphere had shifted. I wasn't just a girl in a robe anymore. I was a threat. As I walked out toward the courtyard, I saw Lin Ru waiting near the gate. She looked out of place in her delicate pink silks, like a decorative bird in a den of wolves. My Lin, she hurried toward me, her eyes darting around. You have to stop. The prince is furious. He says if you keep embarrassing the nobility with these accusations, he won't be able to protect you. He says he'll have you stripped of your rank. I looked at her, and then I looked at the shadow lurking behind a nearby pillar. I knew Yang Ju was listening. Protect me. I laughed, the sound sharp and cold. Ruo, look at me. I have the Emperor's ear, the Grand Secretary's support, and the law on my side. I don't need a prince to protect me. In fact, I raised my voice slightly. Tell the prince that if he continues to use his influence to hide his friend's corruption, he's the one who will need protection. From me. I walked away, my boots clicking firmly on the stone. That night, as I sat in my office at the ministry, a shadow fell across my desk. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of cold rain and expensive ink preceded him. You made a lot of enemies today, Lu Shen said, leaning against the doorframe. A career without enemies is just a hobby, I replied, finally looking up. He walked over and placed a small wooden box on my desk. Inside was a high-quality inkstone, carved with a lotus flower. The Empress Dowager has taken notice of you, he said softly. She wants to meet the woman who made Minister Chen tremble. Be careful, Mylin. The court is a garden of snakes, and you've just stepped on the biggest one. I grew up in the modern world, Lu Shen, I whispered, a half-smile on my face. I've dealt with worse than snakes. I've dealt with stakeholders. He didn't understand the word, but he understood the look in my eyes. He reached out, his fingers brushing mine for a fraction of a second as he closed the box. Then let us see, he said, how the villainess rewrites the history of this empire. The invitation arrived on gold-flecked paper. The Empress Dowager was hosting a spring viewing banquet. In the original novel, this was the scene where Song Mylin was drugged and found in a compromising position with a common guard, forcing her to be cast out in disgrace. But I wasn't reading the script anymore. I was rewriting it. I arrived at the summer palace not in the heavy, restrictive gown of a noblewoman, but in a streamlined, dark teal silk robe with high-slit skirts over matching trousers, a design that allowed for both elegance and movement. While the other ladies looked like decorative vases, I looked like a woman who could run a marathon or win a debate at a moment's notice. Look at her, I heard a duchess whisper. She dresses like a common clerk. Has she no shame? I ignored them. I walked straight to the Empress Dowager's pavilion. The most powerful woman in the empire sat behind a translucent silk screen. Beside her sat Yang Ju, looking stiff, and Lin Ru, who was wearing a dress so pale and thin she looked like she might catch a cold if someone breathed too hard. Minister Song, the Empress Dowager's voice was like aged wine, smooth but potent. I hear you think our tax laws are inefficient. A bold claim for someone who has only held office for a month. I knelt, but I didn't bow my head. Your Majesty, bold is just another word for honest. I simply believe that the strength of a crown is measured by the fullness of the people's rice bowls, not the weight of the treasury's gold. The Empress Dowager chuckled. A populist. How dangerous. The banquet proceeded with a series of musical performances. I watched my cup like a hawk. I saw Linru whispering to a palace maid, her eyes darting toward me with a mixture of fear and malice. When the maid approached me with a tray of hibiscus wine, I didn't take the cup. I took the whole tray. Thank you, I said with a sharp smile. I'll serve myself. The maid turned pale and scurried away. I poured the wine into a nearby potted plant. Within minutes, the leaves began to wilt. Typical, I thought. A sedative and an irritant. The classics never die. Suddenly, Yang Ju stood up, his face flushed with wine. Grandmother, since Minister Song is so dedicated to efficiency, perhaps she should show us her skills. I've heard she's been spending her nights in the archives with Grand Secretary Liu. Is that the kind of work you're doing, Mylin? The garden went silent. It was a direct hit to my reputation, the one thing a woman in this world couldn't afford to lose. I stood up slowly. I felt Lucian shift in his seat across the garden, his hand tightening around his fan. But I didn't need him to defend me. Your Highness, I said, my voice projecting with the cold authority of a courtroom litigator. I spend my nights in the archives because the Ministry of Works lost the records for the imperial granaries. Records that, interestingly enough, show a massive shortage of grain that was supposed to be sent to the border troops commanded by your cousin. I pulled a small, ink-stained ledger from my sleeve. I don't need to defend my virtue, Prince. I need you to defend your budget. Because according to this, 50,000 taels of silver disappeared last month. Would you like to explain where it went? Or should we ask the Empress Dowager to audit your personal accounts? Yang Ju's face went from red to white. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was a man who fought with shadows and rumors. He had no idea how to fight a woman armed with data. The Empress Dowager leaned forward, the beads on her phoenix crown clinking. Is this true, Song Mylin? The numbers don't lie, Your Majesty, I said, stepping forward and presenting the ledger. Corruption is like a termite. It doesn't scream, it just eats until the house falls down. I'm just here to point out the holes. The Empress Dowager signaled for her head eunuch to take the book. She flipped through the pages, her expression becoming increasingly grim. Yang Ju, she said softly, you told me Mylin was disturbed. You didn't mention she was doing your job better than you are. Grandmother, she's lying. Linru cried out, forgetting her fragile persona. She's just bitter because Jua loves me. She's trying to frame him. I turned to Linru, my gaze piercing. Rua, this isn't a romance novel. This is a government. If you can't tell the difference between a broken heart and a broken treasury, you have no business being in this palace. The Empress Dowager stood up. The banquet is over. Minister Song, follow me. Yang Ju, stay. We have much to discuss. As I walked away, I felt a hand brush against my sleeve. It was Lucian. You didn't just step on the snake, he whispered, his eyes glowing with a dark, dangerous admiration. You cut its head off in front of the whole garden. I told you, I replied, adjusting my official belt. I'm not here to play. I'm here to win. But as I followed the Empress Dowager into the inner sanctum, I realized the stakes had just changed. I wasn't just a villainess anymore. I was the most dangerous person in the capital. And in the dark corners of the palace, I could hear the sharpness at work. The inner sanctum of the Empress Dowager was a place where history was decided in whispers. She sat on her throne, the ledger I had provided lying open on a low table between us. Outside, the sounds of the banquet had faded into a tense, heavy silence. You realize, she began, her eyes tracing the sharp lines of my handwriting, that by exposing the Crown Prince's negligence, you have effectively ended your chances of ever becoming Empress. Even if he forgives you, the clan elders will never allow a woman who betrays her husband to sit beside him. I didn't blink. Your Majesty, I never wanted a crown that required me to keep my eyes shut. I would rather be a fourth-rank official with a clear conscience than an empress who has to beg for her husband's scraps. The Empress Dowager looked at me for a long time. Then, she did something unexpected. She laughed. Song Mylin, You are either the bravest woman in Liang, or the most foolish. But I find I don't care which. This corruption goes deeper than my grandson. It reaches the Ministry of Rights and the Border Defense. She pushed the ledger back toward me. Investigate it. I am giving you the authority of a royal censor. If you find the missing gold, I will grant you one wish. If you fail, the prince will have your head for slander. The investigation was a descent into the belly of the beast. I spent the next 2 weeks living in the Ministry of Justice, fueled by tea and the sheer spite of knowing Yang Ju was watching my every move. I wasn't alone, though. Lu Xun was there every night. We worked in a comfortable, intellectual silence, the only sound the rustle of paper and the occasional click of his abacus. You're looking for a ghost, Lu Xun said one night, leaning over my shoulder. The warmth of his presence was distracting, a sharp contrast to the cold stone of the archives. The money wasn't just stolen, it was laundered through the silk trade in the western provinces. I know, I said, pointing to a discrepancy in the transport logs. Look at the weights. The wagons leaving the capital were empty, but they required 4 horses to pull them. They weren't carrying silk. They were carrying silver bullion. Our hands met over the map. I didn't pull away. In this life, I had built walls of logic and fire to keep everyone out, but Lu Xun didn't try to climb them. He simply stood beside them until I opened the gate. Mylin, he whispered, his voice dangerously low. When this is over, when you've torn down the prince and rebuilt the ministry, what do you want for yourself? I looked at the map, then at him. I want a world where a woman's value isn't a calculation of her dowry. And a partner, he asked. What about a man who doesn't want to protect you, but wants to be protected by your brilliance? Before I could answer, the door to the archives burst open. Yang Ju stood there, his eyes bloodshot, a sword hanging loosely at his side. Behind him, Lin Ru cowered, her eyes wide with a terrifying, frantic energy. So it's true, Yang Ju hissed, looking at the two of us. The virtuous official and the Grand Secretary are plotting treason in the dark. Did you think I wouldn't find out, Mylin? Did you think I'd let you ruin me for a few bags of grain? It wasn't a few bags, Jua, I said, standing up. I felt Lu Xun move instinctively in front of me, but I stepped around him. It was the survival of the empire. You sold out the border guards for a palace in the south and a string of pearls for a girl who doesn't even love you. Shut up, he screamed, drawing his sword. Lin Ru stepped forward, her voice trembling. Jua, stop. Mylin, please, give him the papers. If you give them to us, we can fix this. We can be a family again. I looked at the girl I was supposed to be jealous of. I saw the desperation in her eyes, the fear of a woman who had bet everything on the wrong man and was now watching the house burn. There is no us, Rua, I said. And there is no fixing treason. Yang Ju lunged. The blade whistled through the air, aimed directly at my throat. I didn't scream. I didn't move. Because I knew something he didn't. Clang. The sword was deflected by a silver-tipped staff. The Empress Dowager's personal guards swarmed the room from the hidden passages behind the shelves. The Empress Dowager herself stepped out of the shadows, her face a mask of disappointment. I hoped my grandson was merely incompetent. I see now he is also a coward. Grandmother. Yang Ju fell to his knees, the sword clattering to the floor. She set me up. Mylin lured me here. The ledgers lured you here, I said, looking down at him. A guilty conscience is its own trap. You didn't come here to stop treason. You came here to commit it. As the guards dragged him away, Lin Ru collapsed into a heap of silken tears. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a profound sense of exhaustion. The male lead was gone. The heroine was broken. The script was officially dead. Lu Xun walked over to me, picking up the discarded sword. He looked at the blade, then at me. The emperor will strip him of his title by dawn. The throne is empty, Mylin. And the court is looking for a leader. I don't want the throne, I said, rubbing my tired eyes. I want the Ministry of Justice. Then you shall have it, a voice said. The Empress Dowager looked at me, a strange glint in her eyes. But first, we must deal with the fallout. A prince has fallen. A villainess has risen. The people will need a story they can believe in. Tell them the truth, I said. Tell them that in the great Liang, the ink of a scholar is more powerful than the blood of a prince. The morning of the great trial, the capital held its breath. The imperial court was no longer a place of petty whispers, it was a hall of judgment. For the first time in history, a woman sat at the high table of the royal censors, her charcoal robe stark against the sea of ceremonial crimson. Yang Ju was brought in, not in silk, but in the white linen of a prisoner. Beside him, Lin Ru looked like a wilted lily, her victim act finally failing her in the face of cold, hard evidence. Song Mylin, Yang Ju spat, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. You think you've won? You've destroyed the lineage of the throne for a career. Who will marry you now? Who will even look at you without fear? I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. I stood up and unrolled the final scroll, the one I had spent 48 hours straight finalizing with Lu Shun. This isn't about marriage, Yang Ju. This is about accountability, I said, my voice echoing with a clarity that silenced the room. You diverted 300,000 taels from the Northern Defense Fund. Because of your greed, 500 soldiers froze to death last winter. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed every person who calls this empire home. I turned to the emperor, who sat on the throne, looking older than I had ever seen him. Your Majesty, the law is not a suggestion for the powerful. It is a shield for the weak. If we do not punish the prince, then the law itself is a lie. The emperor looked at his grandson, then at the girl who had once been a villainess in his court. He sighed, a sound of an era ending. Yang Ju is hereby stripped of his title and exiled to the cold temples of the West. Lin Ru is to be sent to the border laundries to work off the debt of the jewels she wore while soldiers starved. The guards moved in. As they dragged Yang Ju out, he reached for me, a desperate, pathetic look in his eyes. Mylin, I can change. I'll give you everything. I didn't even look back. I was already looking at the map of the next 5 years. The months that followed were a whirlwind of reform. As the first female Grand Secretary, a title the Emperor created specifically for me after the trial, I didn't just change the laws, I changed the culture. I opened the Lotus Academy, a school for girls from all walks of life to study law, mathematics, and administration. I watched as the daughters of merchants and the daughters of dukes sat side by side, their fingers stained with ink just like mine had been. One evening, after the last candle had burned low in the ministry, I walked out into the courtyard. The snow was falling, just as it had in the prologue of my first life. But I wasn't cold. I was wearing furs bought with my own salary, and my heart was whole. You're working late again, a voice called out. Lu Shun stood by the gate, a paper lantern in his hand. He looked at me with that same quiet, unwavering respect. There's always more to do, Lu Shun, I said, leaning against the stone pillar. The tax codes in the East are still a mess. The tax codes can wait until tomorrow, he said, stepping closer. He didn't offer me a ring or a promise of a happily ever after in a gilded cage. He offered me a file. I've drafted a proposal for a joint diplomatic mission to the Western Kingdoms. They've heard of the Iron Lady of Liang and want to discuss trade. I looked at the proposal, then at him. You want me to go with you? I want to go with you, he corrected. I'm just the secretary. You're the one they're afraid of. I laughed, a genuine, warm sound that echoed in the quiet night. I realized then that I hadn't just survived the villainous plot. I had outgrown it. I had found a man who didn't want to own me, but to run beside me. 10 years later, I stood on the balcony of the Grand Secretariat, looking out over a city that hummed with a new kind of energy. The markets were full, the granaries were overflowing, and for the first time in history, 3 women were sitting for the final round of the imperial exams. I saw a carriage passing by, carrying a woman in simple, coarse robes. It was Lin Ru. She was working as a teacher in a village school, finally using her mind for something other than manipulation. She looked up and saw me. For a moment, our eyes met. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply nodded, a gesture of mutual survival. Yang Ju was a ghost, a name mentioned only in history books as a warning. I felt a hand on my waist. Lucian stood beside me, his hair touched with a bit of silver, but his eyes as sharp as ever. The Emperor is waiting for the new budget, Mylin, he whispered. Let him wait 5 minutes, I replied, leaning my head on his shoulder. I'm enjoying the view. I had transmigrated into a tragedy, but I had written myself a triumph. I didn't need to be the female lead of a romance. I was the protagonist of my own life. The ink was dry. The story was mine. And for the first time, it was a story worth living. Thank you for joining me on Maylene's journey. Tell me which moment shocked you the most or touched your heart the deepest. Your comments mean the world to me. They help me keep creating more stories like this. Please like, subscribe, and share. Your support keeps Lotus Tale Studios alive. See you in the next story.